Boston Labor Solidarity Committee, which is putting on this talk today. And just a few of the things that we stand for are solidarity embracing workers around the world struggling against their bosses, support for social ownership and democratic control of wealth, and opposition to capitalism and imperialism. And there's a few more too. You can check it out on our website. Just Google Boston Labor Solidarity Committee, and we'd love to hear from you. And we meet once a month here at the Democracy Center, so we're pretty convenient. And our speaker today on the general strike past, present, and future is John Beckham from Philadelphia. John has been an activist in the labor movement for, I'm sure, over 40 years at this point. He's a past General Secretary Treasurer of the IWW, past editor of the Industrial Worker, rest in peace, and also the current editor of the Anarcho-Syndicalist Review. So without further ado, Mr. John Beckham.
I might get better audio if the volume on your computer was down. I think it's making an echo. Oh, okay. Okay. So I was asked, and initially we were going to do this in October, but we've been trying to work around the pandemic, which has not been fully cooperating with us. It's supposed to be over now. But to speak about the general strike, and I have maybe 15 to 20 minutes of remarks. I haven't actually timed them because it makes no difference. I will find myself elaborating at some point. And then we'll throw it open to questions, arguments, and such. Can I be heard okay? I saw that there were some comments, well, a comment anyway, hoping that I would lecture without the mask. I believe it's policy of the Democracy Center that I should keep the mask on. And I'm hoping that I'm fully audible. But if I'm not fully audible, please let me know and I'll try to do something about it. I do have the chat open. So general strikes have a long history in the United States and around the world. A history that I'm only going to touch on briefly so that we have some time to consider the relevance of general strikes in the modern era and the reasons why the general strike has always been seen as the labor movement's most powerful weapon. Over the years, general strikes have been called for a wide range of purposes: to halt wars, to topple dictatorships, to demand shorter working hours, to win union recognition, to defend labor and political rights, to build a new society, and I'm sure others as well. General strikes have been held on every continent except Antarctica. I'm not aware of one there. There have been withdrawals of workers' labor, of course, for as long as there have been exploiters. You go back in history and we can find examples of withdrawals of labor recorded in ancient religious texts, thousands of years of workers withdrawing their labor to try to enforce better conditions. The first recorded advocacy for a general strike as such seems to have been, and I'm always reluctant to say that something is the first because then somebody goes and finds some earlier argument, seems to have been in January of 1832, when William Benbow published the pamphlet, Grand National Holiday and Congress of the Productive Classes. The very title speaks to the emancipatory power and vision that are implicit in the general strike. A grand holiday from exploitation. Doesn't that sound just delightful? And coupled with the constructive work, the Congress of the Productive Classes, the constructive work of deciding how society might better be organized. Benbow proposed an extended general strike by the working classes, during which local committees would keep the peace and elect delegates to a convention which would decide upon the future direction of the nation. Chartists endorsed the idea in 1839 and launched the general strike in 1842 after their demands for political reform and better conditions were rejected. This was the first of several European general strikes demanding democracy, the right to organize, and improved working conditions. Many had at least some success. In 1893, for example, Belgian workers waged a general strike that won the right for all men to vote, not women, of course. although the exploiters under this agreement got multiple votes, while workers only got one. So it's progress, particularly since there are more workers, and so it is conceivable that they can outvote the exploiters, but it's not what you would call democratic. Early workers' organizations also recognized the general strike as a potential means of restraining governments from declaring war upon one another. The idea was not uncontroversial. Karl Marx wrote Friedrich Engels on October 16, 1868, denouncing, quote, the Belgian nonsense that it was necessary to strike against war, unquote. Despite this, the International Working Men's Association declared at its 1869 conference that if war broke out, a general strike should take place. When war broke out between France and Germany the next year in 1870, the Paris section of the International immediately denounced the war, but most German socialists declared that it was defensive. Only Wilhelm Liebknecht and August Bebel refused to vote for war credits and spoke against the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine in the Reichstag. Behind the scenes, Marx wrote Friedrich Engels, the French need a drubbing. If the Prussians are victorious, then the centralization of state power will give help to the centralization of the working class. In public, however, he took a very different view. Writing a statement on behalf of the International Working Men's Association, the alliance of the working classes of all countries will ultimately kill war. The very fact that while official France and Germany are rushing into a fratricidal feud, the workmen of France and Germany send each other messages of peace and goodwill. This great fact, unparalleled in the history of the past, opens the vista of a brighter future. Messages of peace and goodwill are all very well, but the general strike that had been promised the year before never materialized, even after Paris rose up, established the Paris Commune, and ceased the war. Instead, German troops helped the Thiers regime reestablish control, massacring the communards in the process. The official declarations of the First International aside, German socialists supported every war their masters embarked upon, even as growing numbers of workers around the world and in Germany came to recognize the need for mass strikes. In 1907, when French socialists called on the International to commit to all means, including general strikes and insurrections, to resist wars, German socialists strongly objected. Instead, the Congress ultimately called for protests against war, but not active resistance. French unions continued to call for general strikes against war up until 1914, when the CGT union pledged its, quote, sacred union, in French, of course, with the French government in waging World War I, though a significant minority rejected this change of course. But many unions and radicals continued looking to general strikes as part of a broader anti-militarist strategy throughout the war. As Helen Keller put it in a 1916 speech at Carnegie Hall, strike against all ordinances and laws and institutions that continue the slaughter of peace and the butchery of war. Strike against war, for without you, no battles can be fought. Strike against manufacturing shrapnel and gas bombs and all other tools of murder. Strike against preparedness, that means death and misery to millions of human beings. Be not dumb, obedient slaves in an army of destruction. Be heroes in an army of construction. This is sound advice, and many workers have tried to put it into practice. In 1905, Swedish workers threatened a general strike should the Swedish government attempt military force to maintain its rule over Norway. And this forced the Swedish king to back down and pledge that he would not deploy the military. The Australian general strike of 1917 was in large part a reaction to government efforts to impose conscription, efforts the government was forced to abandon in the face of strikes, mass protests, and the loss of 2 referenda, where workers voted against being drafted into the army. Much of Ireland was shut down in April 1918 by a general strike against the proposed extension of military conscription from Britain to Ireland. Another Irish general strike was called 4 years later, as tensions between the over partition grew and tensions between the pro and anti-treaty forces were preparing for armed conflict. The general strike called not for support of one faction or the other, but rather against the militarism of both sides, demanding that there ought not to be an armed conflict over this question. And Dutch workers held an unsuccessful general strike on February 25th, 1941, to protest persecution of Jews under the Nazi occupation and demand that it come to an end. That strike, like I say, was not successful. This has something to do with Nazi occupation. The idea of a general strike arises naturally from the condition of exploitation. In 1835, Boston carpenters resumed a series of strikes for a 10-hour workday that had been going on for some years, and were soon joined by masons and stonecutters. Their circular read, in part, "We have been too long subjected to the odious, cruel, unjust, and tyrannical system which compels the operative mechanic to exhaust his physical and mental powers. We have rights and duties to perform as American citizens and members of society, which forbid us to dispose of more than 10 hours for a day's work." The Boston strikers organized a traveling committee to request the assistance of workers in other cities. Their strike was eventually defeated, but their circular inspired workers in Philadelphia to organize their own, more successful strike for a 10-hour workday. Workers on the coal wharves on the Schuylkill River began the strike, marching to the wharves behind a worker armed with a sword who threatened to cut off the head of anyone who crossed the picket line. The coal heavers were soon joined by workers from many other trades, including leather dressers, printers, carpenters, bricklayers, masons, painters, bakers, and city employees. After the city public works employees joined the strike, Philadelphia City Council quickly conceded the 10-hour day and increased wages for piece workers for everybody who contracted with the city. Over the years, there have been a great many other general strikes in this country, including the St. Louis Commune of 1877 and the 1886 general strike for the 8-hour day, called, by among others, by the American Federation of Labor's forerunner, the Federation of Organized Trades and Labor Unions. But the AFL-L's embrace of general strikes proved to be short-lived. After a wave of general strikes swept across the United States and Canada, the June 1919 AFL convention overwhelmingly passed resolutions condemning the general strike and the idea of building one big union, and prohibiting local labor councils from considering strike votes without first obtaining permission from national union officials. The resolution explicitly noted the need to, quote, check the spread of general strike sentiment and prevent recurrences of what happened at Seattle and is now going on at Winnipeg. So rather than supporting workers in an active strike in Winnipeg, the AFL went on record condemning the general strike. The business unions have remained implacably opposed to general strikes ever since, though this has not always stopped workers from joining them. There have been a great many general strikes in the 1930s, in the 1940s after World War II, in particular, which were participated in by the masses of workers and, in fact, by many unions, despite the AFL-L's official position against them. When the Vermont State Labor Council passed a resolution in November 2020 authorizing a general strike in the event that Donald Trump attempted a coup and refused to leave office, as it happens, not a far-fetched proposition, the AFL-CIO launched an investigation into this misconduct. On June 29th of 2021, AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka sent a, quote, final warning, unquote, to the Vermont Council, threatening to remove its officers and impose a trusteeship if they dared consider a general strike again. So we know where the AFL-CIO Central Council stands on this question. Trumka's reprimand noted the AFL-CIO staffers had offered, quote, several creative alternatives, unquote, to a general strike, including phone banking. They would offer staff to assist with the phone banking, a measure that surely would have caused great consternation to the exploiters. So what is a general strike? A general strike, or sometimes called a mass strike, is a strike action with participation by a substantial proportion of the total labor force, whether in an industry, a city, a region, or a country. They've happened on all of those levels. Many citywide general strikes, many industry-wide general strikes, many national general strikes. Ralph Chaplin in the general strike called for a global general strike. There have been some protests that were called a global general strike, but none that I think had the kind of global labor participation that would actually justify that term. They're characterized by the participation of workers in several workplaces and tend to involve entire communities. Examples of industrial strikes include the 1909 uprising of the 20,000 women garment workers in New York City, which, while ending in a compromise that was far from victory, did lay a foundation for the unionization of New York's needle trades and decades of living wages before the employer skipped town, decamping to places such as Bangladesh. The 1912 strike of Atlantic Coast maritime workers, involving at least 30,000 longshoremen, marine firemen, and other ship workers, closed ports from Boston to Galveston, Texas. That strike won significant gains for dock workers, but union scatting by other crafts undercut the firemen and who had built the movement and their supporters. Defeated and disgusted, the firemen withdrew from the AFL-affiliated International Seamen's Union and joined the IWW, forming, with Philadelphia dock workers, the backbone of its Marine Transport Workers Industrial Union for the next 2 decades. And in 1917, the IWW organized strikes of 100,000 lumberjacks and 40,000 copper miners. The miners were defeated by state terrorism, and hundreds of IWW organizers and activists were illegally arrested and detained to break the timber strike. Nonetheless, the lumberjacks' determination won significantly improved living conditions in the timber camps, and continued struggles over the next few years in the timber fields won the 8-hour day. These struggles so enraged the plutocrats that they barred IWW publications from the mail, raided IWW halls across the country, seizing membership and other records, and imprisoned and later deported many hundreds of IWW officials and activists. Other industrial general strikes include several national strikes of coal miners, dock workers, and rail workers, and more recently, several statewide strikes, often illegal, by teachers. Public sector workers have often turned to general strikes. In 2011, for example, Portuguese public sector workers held a general strike to block austerity measures, which were bad not only for the entire country, but also for them as the people who carried out the government services that were going to be slashed. On September 2nd of 2016, 150 million Indian public sector workers, organized in 10 union federations, held a 24-hour national general strike against government plans for increasing privatization of services and other austerity policies. A great many of these strikes have been successful. Those that failed were often suppressed by military force. Other general strikes have been called in solidarity with other labor struggles. Both the Seattle and Winnipeg general strikes began this way, or to protest government policies or repression. In 1927, for example, the IWW called for a 3-day national walkout, in essence a general strike, to protest the impending execution of Sacco and Vanzetti. No other union seems to have supported the strike call, and so it could not succeed in saving their lives. However, 1,132 coal miners struck in Walsenburg, Colorado, in support of the strike, with only 35 crossing the picket line, which led directly to the IWW's successful statewide strike of coal miners later that year, which shut down the entire coal industry and led the coal operators to invite the United Mine Workers in to represent the coal miners instead of the IWW. Senegalese workers won substantial wage hikes and union recognition in a 3-week general strike in 1946. 2 decades later, in 1968, another general strike forced the release of hundreds of imprisoned activists, as well as winning political reforms and 15% across-the-board wage hikes. In 1968, 11 million French workers joined a wildcat general strike in solidarity with student protesters, whose militant protests had been met with fierce repression. The communist and socialist affiliated union federations had supported a 1-day general strike as a protest measure, but instead of returning to work after marching through the streets of Paris, a march that did secure the release of many prisoners, the strike spread, with demands soon including the resignation of the government and the establishment of self-management in their workplaces. The government teetered under the combined pressure from students and workers. President Charles de Gaulle briefly fled to Germany, returning to Paris only after the military assured him of its support. However, the major unions were as terrified of this as the bosses and worked to challenge the rebellion into narrower economic demands, ultimately negotiating a 35% increase in the minimum wage, a 10% wage increase for other workers, and reduced working hours. So even in defeat, there were gains. Yes, it's not that we can completely dismiss this. Without support from their unions or an organizational structure to carry on, the rebellion petered out, even though workers actually had voted to reject this settlement. But they weren't able to continue without an organizational structure. A successful general strike does require solid organization and clear goals. Few workers will strike unless they have good reason to believe that their fellow workers will strike with them. Typically, this organization is built through a series of struggles in which we develop our organizational capacity, demonstrate our commitment to one another, and come to realize our potential power. We need democratic organizations and systems of accountability so that we are not at the mercy of leaders, charismatic or otherwise, who might sell us short or seek power for themselves or accept compromises that leave the exploiters and oppressors in charge. And I would argue that we need a clear sense of what we are trying to accomplish. The Seattle General Strike of 1919 offers an example of the dangers of avoiding this discussion in hopes of preserving a facade of unity. The impetus for the general strike movement was a strike by 35,000 shipyard workers whose bosses absolutely refused to negotiate. The Metal Trades Council saw the general strike as a way to force the shipyards to the bargaining table. Certainly a worthy goal, and almost certainly a winnable goal. Other unions in other industries voted in favor of the general strike in the hopes of advancing their own grievances and winning on gains. And many workers hoped to overthrow the capitalist system altogether. As Anna Louise Strong wrote in the Seattle Union Record, "We are taking the most tremendous move ever made by labor in this country, a move which will lead no one knows where." These are somewhat disparate goals. The goal of winning negotiations does not sit well with the goal of overthrowing capitalism and establishing a workers' commune, yes? The Union Strike Committee acted responsibly, making arrangements to ensure that people were fed and the sick cared for throughout the strike. The strike was orderly. The provocations of soldiers and hundreds of special deputies sent to intimidate strikers were ignored. Key services continued to operate based on exemptions from the strike committee, although not under the workers' self-management that Strong's editorial had promised. But the failure to agree on the strike's objectives was ultimately fatal. Some unions settled their grievances, and having settled their grievances, they returned to work. Others abandoned the general strike as it became clear that the authorities were intransigent and no resolution was in sight. A general strike with the limited objective of forcing a settlement with the shipyard workers, I believe, could have succeeded. A revolutionary general strike would have required seizing the workplaces and resuming production under workers' control. I'm not persuaded that Seattle's workers could have sustained such measures in isolation. But such a move might have inspired others around the country and around the world, and so laid a foundation for future struggles and an inspiring vision of the new society to be built in the shell of the old. Instead, the strike collapsed in a week, emboldening the exploiters and breaking workers' morale. Half measures can be dangerous. General strikes have played key roles in toppling military dictatorships around the world, from Iran to Thailand. Many generals and politicians have been forced from power by a working class that refused to tolerate their brutal regimes any longer. But too often that is where it stopped, with workers returning home and a new, or sometimes merely reshuffled, set of bosses taking charge. When workers toppled the military regime in Sudan a couple of years ago, they did not follow through to dismantle the military apparatus and establish direct democracy. And today, the generals are back in power, although continuing resistance has left the economy in shambles. Similarly, in Myanmar, a widely supported general strike proved insufficient to topple the regime that sees even the mildest reform as an existential threat. Many countries, like many work sites, are under the thumb of rulers who long ago gave up trying to establish a measure of social legitimacy and instead rule simply through fear and corruption. Such rulers dare not negotiate with organized workers because they know that their control relies on terror and fear that any whiff of resistance would quickly spread. There is a slogan often repeated at demonstrations that proclaims, "The people united will never be defeated." It is unfortunately not true. When the rulers are willing to tolerate economic ruin and prefer piles of corpses to losing power, it is not sufficient to walk out of the workplaces and march in the streets. Rather, the workplaces must be occupied on a permanent basis and soldiers encouraged to mutiny, to refuse the orders to kill. At the very least, the bosses will hesitate to have the army turned on the factories and office buildings and such because they think of that as their property, yes? And so there are some limits to the violence that can be unleashed upon the productive capacity of the economy and some measure of protection. But also, it is a path towards reorganizing society in the preferred direction, where the streets are all very nice, but it is hard to organize an economy from the streets. Tyrants cannot be compromised with. Their promises of power sharing and their transitional regimes are mere ruses to lure our fellow workers into complacency. As we can see in Belarus, Egypt, Myanmar, Sudan, and Syria, there is nothing more dangerous than a dictator with his back against the wall, but still in control of an army. It must be conceded that many general strikes have failed to accomplish their declared objectives, or having won them, have been unable to secure the victory. I mentioned Sudan, where in 2019, millions of workers joined general strikes that forced an end to the 30-year al-Bashir dictatorship, and then quickly toppled the military regime that replaced him. These are significant accomplishments, yes? But instead of seizing their workplaces and communities and reorganizing society on a democratic basis, protesters agreed to a transitional government and the military remained intact, seizing power again last October, eventually reinstating the transitional prime minister as a figurehead after mass protests erupted, but refusing to cede power. And today, the military controls the government absolutely. The prime minister stepped down because he was an ineffectual figurehead. Hundreds have been killed, and the people are back in the streets. As one worker told the Associated Press on January 4th, our three current terms after the coup are no negotiations, no power sharing, no compromise, in addition to the main demands of the revolution, which are freedom, peace, and justice. That's it. We have no other demands. So they remain quite moderate, but nonetheless, the military remains in charge. Similarly, the general strike has failed to topple the military dictatorship in Myanmar, even though there can be no question but that the overwhelming majority of the population opposes the regime. The elections made that clear, the protests made that clear. No reasonable person can argue that the military is carrying out the will of any significant fraction of the people. But the military is unconcerned by the resulting economic crisis and the collapse of any measure of social legitimacy, instead determined to prevail through brute force. In this, it is aided by its ownership of many key industries and its control of smuggling and other criminal operations. The opposition's failure to confront military control, but also its embrace of the poison of nationalism during the period in which it was in government, have crippled the resistance. Sometimes unions have called general strikes to quell rebellion within the ranks, but without taking the steps necessary to make the general strike effective. Such was the case with the 1909 Swedish general strike, the collapse of which led to the foundation of the SAC Syndicalist Union. Other general strikes have been symbolic, called as demonstrations of strength, meant both to give workers the opportunity to vent their anger and perhaps to strengthen union leaders' positions at the bargaining table. There have been many such general strikes, some quite massive, and they have often been effective on their own limited terms. In the past few years, we've seen major protest general strikes in Argentina, Belarus, Catalonia, Chile, France, French Polynesia, Hong Kong, India, Italy, Myanmar, Nicaragua, Poland, South Korea, Sudan, Thailand, Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and no doubt a great many other countries. Some successfully pressured governments to scale back economic austerity measures or attacks on political rights. One led to a popular convention that is rewriting Chile's constitution. The Zimbabwean president was, of course, forced to step down. A few forced out long entrenched dictators. But many raised demands that, no matter how justified, those in power were unwilling to consider. In such situations, a short protest strike, even a massive one, is not enough. Direct action is needed. Perhaps the largest general strikes in history were held January 8th and November 26th of 2020, with 200 million or more workers and small farmers protesting and striking across India. The strikers demanded the withdrawal of changes to agricultural and labor laws. These are typically called reforms. Throughout my talk, whenever I use the word reform, it's in quotation marks, otherwise called scare quotes, because there is nothing more scary than a government reform. So withdrawal of changes, reforms to agricultural and labor laws. They demanded economic support and jobs for impoverished Indians, an end to the privatization of government enterprises and services, a universal pension scheme, and withdrawal of the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act. These massive demonstrations shut down major Indian cities, each for a day, and did ultimately force the government to withdraw agricultural reforms that would have hit India's impoverished small farmers quite hard. But broadly speaking, the BJP's economic reform agenda has proceeded to the delight of the rich and corporations and the impoverishment of the great majority. I can only hope that the tens of millions of workers involved in these actions reflect upon their experience and the sense of power that they surely felt gathered in their millions in the streets of every Indian city, and decide to direct that power, that energy, not into symbolic protests against the government that is not at all concerned with the needs and interests of the people, but rather taking charge of the workplaces that rely upon their labor for their very existence, and begin the difficult but vital work of building an economy, a society that abolishes hunger and want, that democratizes industry, that makes the good things of life available to all. The IWW has been preeminent among unions in the United States in advocating for a general strike. Bill Haywood spoke in the early 1900s about a general lockout of the employing class. Joe Hill, in his songs, noted that workers had the power to bring both employers and generals to heel, should they only exercise it. Ralph Chaplin, in his pamphlet, The General Strike, differentiates between general strikes that shut down an industry to win better working conditions, local, regional, and national general strikes that protest injustices or demand reforms, and the general strike, designed to abolish private ownership of the means of life and to supplant it with social ownership. In such a strike, workers would not vacate their workplaces to protest in the streets, but would instead take possession of the workplaces and send the employers and their minions into the streets. There are many practical advantages to such an approach. It is far easier to hold the means of production, and of course we are already in the workplaces operating them. It is far easier to hold the means of production than to seize them. If our goal, or at least one of our goals, is to achieve democratic control of the economy, what better way to do that than to lock out the employing class, remain in possession of the means of production, and democratically administer them through our unions? With the means of meeting our needs at hand, the transition from the profit system to production and distribution to meet human needs, and from boss rule to democracy, will be in the hands of those already accustomed to operating the vast, complex array of industries. It will, of course, require organization, but a working class sufficiently organized to lock out the employing class and its host of parasites will also be sufficiently organized to have thought about how we wish to structure the new society and how to go about the constructive work of building it. This, of course, is the main issue. A general strike cannot simply be declared. When I was editing The Industrial Worker, I once received a letter complaining that I had received a circular. I don't actually recall receiving a circular, but nonetheless, I had received a circular calling for a general strike on May 1st of that year, and I had not published it. And because I had not published it, the general strike had failed. You cannot simply declare a general strike. You have to organize it. You have to build power to make it a reality, yes? It must be consciously built as part of a process that builds revolutionary unions, develops a strong sense of solidarity and awareness of our power, and develops our determination, our capacity to act for ourselves. Thank you. So, questions, comments, arguments? Yes.
Yeah, I thought, unfortunately, I got here a little late, but I thought that was a wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you talked about May 1st, 2006, maybe before I got here. There were about 2.5 million who struck that day. Of course, you went over so many. I mean, it's easy to miss a couple. I mean, but that was a strike, a general strike of immigrants, both documented and undocumented, and their supporters. You know, it was all over. The biggest mobilization was in LA, where about 1 million people came out into the street. The other thing is, I wanted to point out, you did go over the San Francisco general strike. That was also in that same year, 1934, that there was a general strike pretty much in Minneapolis, Minnesota, as well as Toledo, Ohio. So there was a general strike movement, in my opinion, in 1934, which led to the organization of the CIO. But there again, it's hard to cover all this material, you know, in one lecture. I mean, but I wanted to point that out as well. The police, the army, they come in, you know, when there's a general strike quite often in history. And I think we also have to talk about, you know, the working class armed and ready to confront the state power when they move in on, you know, general strikes in the organized working class. And that's also part of world history. So I'll leave it at that.
The armed force of the state is certainly a very real issue, as I mentioned. And the CGT, back when it proclaimed general strikes and before it, you know, got into sacred unions with the bosses, had an official policy of anti-militarist agitation, where they would go out into the army and try to incite rebellion or at least rebellious thoughts. And there have been situations, so for example, in Spain, when the fascists rose, many elements of the military and police, not all by any means, but many elements sided with workers in putting down the fascist coup in a majority of Spain. And had it not been for support from Germany and Italy and embargoes on weapons and a range of other forces. But it is absolutely essential. I did make mention of the need to appeal to armies and police, of course, similarly. And that's not, for armies, most people in most armies are in fact workers, drawn from the ranks of the working class. And it ought to be possible to persuade them. And there have been many instances where they have been persuaded that they don't wish to open fire upon their fellow workers. Police are a somewhat harder task. There have been strikes of police that were actually in solidarity. So the Boston police strike, for example, seems to have been a legitimate expression of working class opposition. No?
Not many.
But most police strikes have not exactly been in solidarity with the working class. And that, I'm not saying it can't be confronted, and I'm not saying it doesn't need to, but it is a harder.
Yeah, I just want to observe that in 1934, during the San Francisco general strike, which grew either a longshoremen's general strike, at the Battle of Rincon Hill, the strikers beat the crap out of the cops. As likewise in Minneapolis, the striking Teamsters beat the crap out of the cops. They surrounded the cops entirely in such a way that the cops were not able to draw their weapons and that their clubs were rendered useless. And moreover, in Toledo, the same year, the police, who had been stiffed on a pay raise by the city authorities, did absolutely nothing to suppress the auto-like strike, although the sheriff's department was active in opposing the strikers. But in all three of those general strikes, the strikers won.
Yeah, police cannot be ignored. And Perhaps if you can get them not to attack you, I think that is the favored option.
Yeah.
But you certainly cannot just sit around and kneel down in front of them and say, "Here's my head bashed in." That is an option that has no appeal to the majority of the working class, I think, and little chance of success. Well, depending on your goal. If your goal is to get your head beaten, then it'll probably work very well. But yes, the question of military force, I believe that a well-organized movement is less likely to face these issues.
That's right.
Because police, many of them also are drawn from the ranks of the working class on the one hand, although there is a certain ideology, I think, that leads people into that direction. But also they do live in the communities. And if they know that people are determined, they're less likely to feel inclined to risk themselves and their well-being, I think, in making such an attack. But yes, it is a very real issue. I don't need to downplay it. And frankly, you look at Myanmar, you look at Sudan, you look at Egypt, you look at Iran. It is clear that you cannot leave military and police forces in the hands of your enemies and hope to be alive much longer.
I'm wondering about what's called the Great Resignation, and I don't know if that's just a ploy, but they're talking about a Great Resignation throughout the country, and if that is an actual thing, how does that relate to that possibly transitioning into a general strike? And what do you think? That's one piece, but what do you think are the possibilities of us coming together in the present for a general strike?
Organization, I think, is the key question here. And so on the one hand, there is a need to build organizations, whether that's traditional unions, whether that's a resurgence of rank and file unions or worker centers or such. But working people need to come together, build bonds of solidarity, discuss action. The Great Resignation, to the extent that it's real, it's lots of individuals acting at the same time, but it would be much more effective if individuals who worked for a particular employer acted together, yes? Yes. To the extent that it's intended to object to or existing conditions or win better conditions. Unions have to be built, and we have to organize to get more than crumbs. I am not persuaded personally that the workers are as well organized at this moment as some would have us believe. I know a guy who just before the pandemic went and got himself a commercial truck driver's license because his bosses had sold the printing equipment he was working on. And so he took a buyout when it was offered because they had sold the machines he worked, and therefore his job could not last long, yes? It has now been almost 2 years, and he has not been able to find a job. I say this, he does have certain conditions for a job. He does want to be home from time to time. There is one company that's proposed that he could drive for a month and then be home for 2 days, then drive for a month. That seems to him not a life. But he has gone on dozens and dozens of interviews. And I don't mean to generalize from one person, but I believe that there are plenty of people out there who, if they were offered work under acceptable conditions, would consider it. And yes, the unemployment rate is way down, but so is labor force participation. And of course, that also does speak to the lack of childcare and social infrastructure and such that make it almost impossible for people with children sometimes to take jobs. Should we go to the, Matt, did you want to take over the audience?
Sure, I could ask a question or people can
You're muted.
Raise their hands. I think there's a button for raising your hand. Maybe I can just call on people or you can put your question in the chat if you don't want to speak. I see Sean Kane and then Jeffrey Stein. Sean, you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, John Beckham, for speaking. Quick question. Just let's pretend we live in the greatest environment for union organizing and community organizing. Just humor me. What would it look like in North America? The perfect general strike unfolding tomorrow.
Okay.
Just
So-
use positivity, enthusiasm. Let me hear your vision.
Yes. I am assuming that this tomorrow is the end of a decade or more of organizing, of building committees, of waging struggles, of establishing better conditions through direct action in our workplaces, all of that, yes? So that we're not just suddenly from the heavens. And in that situation, and this does require discussion among the workers as to what we want. We cannot impose our vision, and especially if our vision is democratically self-managed workplaces, that can't be imposed. But assuming that there are these discussions and workers agree, I would say, and Ralph Chaplin actually suggests, I think it was Bill Haywood said that the general strike wouldn't need to last more than 2 minutes because you just pause work in the workplace, invite the managers to leave, and resume production. And fundamentally, we would need to establish organs within our workplaces to make decisions about what we were going to make. Over the longer term, in the immediate term, you resume production and you use the existing economic structures and relations and such to get goods and services out to the people who need them. Over the longer term, there would need to be some social-wide discussions about what we wanted to make, what we didn't want to make, how we wanted to do it. So there are certain products that perhaps we could do without, nuclear bombs, for example. But many other products that we could do without as well that exist in the world, yes? There are conditions under which we labor, why do we labor 8 hours a day or increasingly 10 or 12 hours a day, or in the case of theatrical stage employees, 20 or 24 hours in a day? Why do we do this? When Ben Franklin talked about how he believed that 3 or 4 hours a day would be sufficient to meet people's needs back 200 years ago. It's clearly that we do this because there's a lot of parasites and withdrawal of productive capacity. So that there would need to be societal-wide discussions, committees of workers, whether through their union structures, whether through communes. In Russia, they called them Soviets. But there would need to be some mechanism where we sat down and talked about, okay, we've taken over the communities, the means of production. What do we want to, how do we want to reorganize this? What do we want to build towards? Starting from where we are, but necessarily not just accepting that we keep everything going the way it is, because there's no point making a social revolution if we're just going to maintain things as they are, right?
Thank you.
Jeffrey Stein?
Yeah, I just had a question. I remember during some of the in 2020, while the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, and there was concern about Trump trying to stay in power. There was a group, an independent group, as far as I know, in the South somewhere, in one of the southern states, that was trying to organize for a general strike. Does anybody know anything about that group? I think they called themselves the 2020 General Strike Committee or something. I'll just throw it out there for anybody.
Payday Report has established a website where they try to track all the strikes that happen around the country. And there were a lot of Black Lives Matter strikes that were held in different communities. I don't know anything about that particular group. Maybe somebody else does, and if they do, bring it forward. But
Okay.
other questions?
Hey, John, maybe I could jump in with the question. My name is Matt Andrews. I'm with the Boston Labor Solidarity Committee. It seems to me that at least, well, aside from the immigrant strike that John from the audience mentioned earlier, the immigrant strike in 2006, perhaps the greatest work stoppage of our lives was April of 2020, when this strange new virus started spreading around the world. And I mean, it was just incredible. I mean, you go out in the street in the middle of a workday and nobody's on the road. You know, gas prices were like $1 a gallon. It was kind of, and on the one hand, like the ultimate expression of the power of the work stoppage. Yet at the same time, and you've talked about this to some degree already, that you know, the lack of organization meant that, you know, there weren't any real demands put forward to, and so we really, in a large degree, failed to gain, make any kind of progress for working people out of that work stoppage. You know, not even, you know, I mean, we're still talking about health and safety, you know, basic things for people going back to work during this pandemic. So I kind of wonder if you think there are lessons from that for us today, like, you know, have people been, do you think there's the potential for people to be inspired by the power of the work stoppage who'd never maybe thought of it before? Or do you think that the lack of organization means that it's just, you know, going to disappear down the memory hole? I'm just kind of curious, like, because it really seems to show both the power and the limitation of simply stopping going to work.
Lack of organization is not necessarily a permanent condition. So it is possible to go in and organize people who have not previously been organized, yes? And in the process of that organization, recover those memories and concretize those memories. But there does need to be a sustained effort of going out to people, talking to people, addressing some of the issues that have been made really clear by this, including the dismal state of our health system, which is just appallingly, you know, bad and inadequate. But there have also been, I think, other things that we can see from this pandemic situation, where I think it has made it really clear, at least it ought to have made it really clear, that a great deal of the work that's being done actually isn't necessary, because a great deal of people stopped doing the work. And did society collapse? I mean, some people suffered, to be sure, and there were major health problems, but that's because we don't have a healthcare system. But people mostly did continue to eat, yes, even though farmers were destroying food, you know, mountains of food, because they had no way to distribute it. That is a solvable problem. The healthcare system, frankly, is a solvable problem. And these should be opportunities that we need to seize to go out and talk to people, our fellow workers, our members of our community and such, about what did we do that worked, what didn't we do that needed to be done, and to try to build some momentum. Because it does show that we don't have to go into work for 10 or 12 hours a day just to stay alive, right? It's not actually necessary. It may impact, actually it didn't even impact profits. Corporate profits did quite well during this pandemic as well. Some corporations lost money. The real people who lost money were small businesses like restaurants and, you know, such forth. But the corporations did pretty well. The number of billionaires in the world skyrocketed. I don't know about you. I did not become a billionaire during the pandemic. Clearly, this is a failure of social organization. Yes?
Right. Can I say something? Are you guys hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't mean to butt in. I want to know if it's my turn. I don't know how to do this. That's why.
Go ahead.
Okay.
You can go ahead. There's also somebody, FSC, I don't know who that is. If you wanted to raise his hand, can be on the stack.
Well, what I wanted to, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
I wanted to raise the point that we talk about general strikes, and I'm thinking about when you have a huge general strike, you're also going to have conflicting interests. One person's useful industry or essential industry, you're going to maybe put another group of workers out of a job. They may not see it the same way you do. The issues get more complex as the size of the and the demands of the organization get more complex. And even time changes things. For example, no one admires more what the old time Wobblies did than I admire them. They were wonderful men. But what is the modern view of an industry like lumber?
So on the one hand,
What's the situation there? Or how about coal miners? This doesn't mean I'm for Margaret Thatcher, please. It's not what I'm getting at. But what I mean is there are these issues that come up, and how you deal with them. I think that the inter-worker problems, maybe we tend to, in our enthusiasm, overlook them.
there will need to be a process of dialogue and discussion about what we need. And I think in some cases, different groups will decide to proceed. So for example, I don't personally see a need for yachts, but I believe some people will want to have them, and they'll probably set up cooperatives of some sort to maintain them, because really it's a whole lot of hassle to have a yacht. But if there were 50 of you who shared a yacht, maybe it might be pleasant. Well, maybe not, I really could see some, but for those who like it, it could be done, yes? The Swedish, the SAC was at one point very strong in the timber industry. And in the 1940s and 50s, they tried to advocate for a policy of sustainable forestry, where instead of going in and clear cutting, they would engage in practices that would keep the forest and even expand the forest while maintaining their livelihoods. And it would have been more work, but it would have also meant the Swedish timber industry no longer exists to a practical extent because it wasn't done. In 1928, the Industrial Worker ran an article by members of the Lumber Workers Union that talked about people who were just cutting down the entire forest and destroying the planet. And on the one hand, this was their livelihood that was being cut down. Yes, in the short term, it was a job, but they could see that once you cut down the whole forest, there is no job. So we need to have discussions about that sort of thing. Some of these industries can and should and must continue to exist, just organized in more sustainable ways. Coal mining, maybe. I mean, there need to be discussions. There are some chemical compounds and such that are derived from coal. There might be some specialty, but we can't be burning coal. I think it's pretty clear. There'll need to be discussions about this. And the Mine Workers Union has actually called for a transition that's organized where their members are trained in new technology. It's not that some mine workers maybe are very bound up with their identity with coal mining, but most of them are bound up in living where they live and having a certain kind of lifestyle. And
I know that if you read Walker Smith's pamphlet on the Everett Massacre in 1915, he has a very nice introduction. Now, I remember when the man wrote this over 100 years ago. And he has a very nice introduction on the origins of the lumber industry in the Pacific Northwest. And he brings out the ecological problems. It was his view that the lumber trust were rooting the ecology of the forests. And that was one of his complaints about it. whereas the old time, the original settlers had a much more sensitive view of how to cut down trees and so on. But I just thought I'd point that out as a side issue. But there is that conflict, and I guess we all understand that. Excuse me.
There's somebody on the chat, FSE. Would you like to introduce yourself? Did you have a question? Okay, if not, Sandra?
I think
FSE is back.
just returned.
Hi.
Maybe you want to ask him again, Matt?
Sure. Sorry, I was momentarily distracted.
Sorry, was that my turn?
Yeah.
I probably should have said this. I also had a question about the Black Lives Matter strikes, but it was already answered. So I'll take a look in my notes and see if I can come up with any more.
Oh, no problem.
Sandra?
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. I think it's such a important topic to be there, and I am so happy to hear you, John. Long time no see you, but I think within your conversation, and I think everybody had realized that the polarization of the working class is even much deeper now with this particular COVID situation, because there were the working class that actually can work from home, versus the one that had to show up to work every day and experience all kinds of situations. But my question really is about how we can recreate the culture of unionization from home to school to work, and now in a situation that you have more ostracized working class that is working from home and doesn't have neither the activity or the socialization that normally give the opportunity to people to talk and develop this camaraderie to advance to a next level. Thank you.
That is really the challenge, I think, of this pandemic on one level, is on the one hand, it makes it clear that many of the existing ways that we work aren't necessary and that a lot of our time is being wasted and all of that. But in another level, many of us are in isolation. And how do we break out of that isolation? And within the confines of the pandemic, I mean, I could say that we should set up worker centers in every neighborhood and get together and organize such. But the pandemic, at some level, militates against that, yes? And Zoom and chat and such is all very well, but I don't think it actually replaces the sitting down at a table with somebody and breaking bread and talking and engaging in projects together. I hope that the pandemic is not always with us, or at least that we can build a healthcare system that enables us to manage it somewhat more effectively. But that is a real challenge, because we do need to rebuild that culture, not just the organizational structures of unions and such, but the culture of solidarity, of talking, and this was always a multifaceted culture. I mean, it was partly based in ethnic societies and working class mutual aid organizations and culture and such forth. It was built in even things like bowling leagues and softball leagues and such. And it was also halls where people sat down and talked about issues and performed music for each other. And it was also in unions. And all of that, I'm old-fashioned. I believe we need to be in rooms together, or parks together, or physical spaces together.
I agree.
Me too.
I agree.
And that's a very unsatisfactory answer, because that's not the condition that we're in, yes? And on some level, we have to try to recreate that as best we can. And there have been a number of successful union organizing campaigns during these isolated times. It's not that nothing can be done. But so we need to do what we can in the current conditions and either fight for societal measures that will address this crisis, or probably both at the same time, develop new ways of sociability, of, solidarity among ourselves. I'm not happy with that answer because I'm not happy with the material conditions. Anyone else?
Eric has his hand up.
Eric?
The floor is open.
Oh, we have someone here.
Yeah. Can people hear me?
Sorry, we'll put you up there.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay. I'm not good at this tech stuff either. Yeah, I wanted to raise some points about what John raised about occupying factories, because I think that's a little more complicated than that. Take the sit-down strike of in Flint in the 30s, a critical moment in the history of the working class movement in the United States. But they occupied the factory because they thought it would make it harder to bring scabs in. They didn't occupy the factory to operate the factory, and I'm not even sure what that would mean, because one auto factory doesn't really do much. It's all interlinked. It's a complicated production process. So to actually make a car, you'd have to occupy not only one factory but a whole series of factories, and you'd have to have them interconnected. So I think that's a real that really doesn't get you very far, to say that you're going to take over the means of production and start producing goods and services. The other thing I was thinking about is the copper miners' strike of Bisbee that the IWW did. Now, the copper mines were running at full scale, 24 hours a day. And what were they doing? They're producing copper for the British Army. That's what they were producing. It was an arms industry, part of the arms industry. Everybody knew that. So when the WAB shut down that production for a while, they were hurting the war. If they would have actually gone in and started producing copper, yeah, the British would have been cool. They don't really care whether they wanted the copper, right? So again, just occupying the means of production. It sounds great, but in fact, it's more complicated than that. What are you producing? How are you producing? All those kinds of things. I actually think you need a revolution before those kind of questions really have a lot of meaning. And one final point, I'm very skeptical about violence as part of the process. And just a matter of fact, there was clashes between police and strikers in Minneapolis in '34. It led to the National Guard and martial law for a month. Not so good. I think one point John made that I agree with is that a working class movement needs discipline. And part of that discipline is to avoid violence if at all possible. Because, that's what they have. They have the guns. They got bombs, they got all kinds of stuff. That's not where we're strong. Where we're strong is in organization, and that's what we should be doing. And when you start romanticizing violence, you're not heading down in a good direction. I want to point one final point. The Wobblies avoided violence wherever possible. And they were in fact quite disciplined in the Bisbee strike that I just talked about, the timber strike that John talked about. Those are all highly disciplined, nonviolent strikes, and they were quite consciously done by the Wobs that way.
On the production question, oh, sorry,
That's Susan. Okay, should I talk now?
Go.
Yeah, okay.
Go ahead, Susan.
All right, well,
You're talking here now.
I'll talk here. What's awful is, what? I'll just talk to Matt. Anyway, I'm a retired childcare worker, and I'm really pretty proud of our industry, I guess you call it. I mean, a lot's been done, and also a lot is on the pavements, on the you know, that kind of really has to happen to be in you know, out there, to be seen, to talk to people. And I think I've seen quite a few instances where the workers in the lower echelon of industry, they know what's going on. And the thing is to have more time and more opportunities, and to, as John said, other people have said, to talk to each other. And so that definitely makes it more difficult. But we've had instances we were in Scotland for 12 years, and they had a pretty good strike way back in, I don't know, 1990 or something. But they did very well, and then we knew about them in the U.S., so we were sort of building more on that. So I think there are a lot of opportunities, and you know, keep what this is. Hope is alive. You know, so I think that we have to go down to the lower levels of industry and see the child care workers. Very important.
One thing I would say about production is that, yes, some places are part of integrated supply chains, but in the Seattle General Strike, for example, they looked at the foodstuffs and thought about how are they going to get foodstuffs distributed to people. And there are some workplaces where you can, in fact, meaningfully engage in production. There are other workplaces where perhaps you can't actually continue it, or where you don't want to continue it. If you're in the middle of a copper-minded supplying copper to the war, maybe you want to prevent the copper from being mined, and maybe that's the most important work you can do, is to keep people alive by, you know, not producing copper. But you can't make those decisions if you're not in possession. And so I think we have to realize, I mean, it's going to be a process. There's not one moment everything is great, the next moment, you know, it's, I believe we have to build power, we exercise power, and I think that the general strike where workers take over industry in our communities is in fact a revolution. And I don't think that I'm calling for something different, but you had something.
Yeah, by the way, my name is Lloyd. I came in a little late, so I couldn't introduce myself earlier. Yeah, the thing about the, the COVID situation, it brings a lot of businesses down. And plus, you're in a situation where, safety is the number one, priority when it comes to, this, type of virus and stuff. And like, I know like during the pandemic, a lot of businesses were pretty much rapidly like failing by the day because, this virus was, kicking in and everything. And I know, this year, as far as like, business-wise, I feel like, everything's been going up and down this year. I mean, last year, I'm sorry. Last year. And yeah, that's what.
Yeah. As far as the Great Resignation and the virus, raised earlier, I think that essentially the huge work stoppage as a result of the virus, I think was very much connected to the Great Resignation, that people started thinking that they didn't have to be working, under such arduous conditions, and they didn't have to. They realized they could live without putting up with all this shit, and I think that was in part why there was a Great Resignation, that people realized they could survive without working, under these bad conditions. They were less, they learned how to survive. They were a little more reluctant to come back to all the bullshit. And that's my opinion. I don't think it's totally connected, but to some degree, I think it was. The other thing is, I agree with John that the general strike that you envision after 10 years organization is indeed a revolution. But I think it's also inevitable that you're going to have a civil war. I don't think many of the police are fascists in uniform, all right? And then you got fascists who aren't members of the police. I see them as the advanced guard of the billionaire class, all right? And they're not going to take it just sitting there, in my opinion. They're going to come out. These people don't give a damn. I mean, some of us here in the Mayday Coalition, we face off against the fascists at a safe distance, of course. I mean, I advocate that we don't get too close to them, or else you'll end up, we have to organize the program we're doing at 6:30 tonight, where we got several individuals, okay, who face various charges from the courts. But anyway, these people, I mean, the ones we face off against, many of them are fearless, they are ideologically driven, and they ain't gonna do that. They're violent, all right? And it's not just a few people. I'm talking like millions of people supported the putsch. And I don't call it an insurrection. I call it a putsch, okay, in the Capitol on January 6th. Okay, millions supported that. They still do, and a lot of them are armed, and they just don't give a damn, quite frankly, many of them. So the point I'm making is that, you're talking Civil War when you talk about the kind of transformation that John's talking about. And then there was one other point I wanted to make, but I forgot. I've been speaking a while anyway, so I'll cut it off right there.
Yeah, honestly, like, in today, society inside the country, we have faced, a number of, crises over the course of the, which we'll call a decade. And there are some, heavy, lessons to actually learn from those situations, And like what, John said earlier, about the fascists, we can't, like what John said earlier, we really cannot be engaging with the fascists, because at the end of the day, these are the folks that will get you into some serious trouble, to the point where, like, it will cost you some serious, like, jail time, And at the same time, we gotta go out there and, shut that whole thing down. Because if we don't shut that whole thing down, and otherwise, these guys are gonna end up, like, continuously, polluting our society, to the point where we're gonna have like a dysfunctionalized society, which is, we don't really want that, and we can't afford to have that on our plate, anymore. Right now, we, as a democracy, we're in the process of trying to, get back on our feet, and making sure that, there are, jobs, available, to the public, and of course to our society, because if you really think about it, we got families at home that, that really need, comfort, love, and, support. And which today this is very, very, very important. We got, the next generation, it's going through the same exact situation like we are. And at the same time, we gotta show the next generation, a prime example, what it means to be in the democracy area. And plus, we just basically just gotta, teach our young ones that, this is what we went through This is where we kind of go through to get to where we need to be today. You know, and today, in today's society, there's so much good. Yeah. And that's why it's very important, you know, for us to, you know, go out and address our society and address the government. You know, I know the government is obviously, you know, obviously not going to listen, but at the end of the day, you gotta keep, you know, trying to send that message, that positive message. You know, this is the only way.
I didn't hear quite the end of that, John. Did you want to respond to that, or should I call in another question?
If there's somebody else, they can go. Otherwise, I can say a few words.
We had FSC on the chat said he had a question, and I see Sean has his hand raised. Would either of you like to go?
I'll go. Spot on comments about the cops. I remember during the January 6th coup attempt, somebody kept going, ACAF, ACAF. I'm guessing that meant all cops are friends, but it really stands all cops are fascists. So I think that worked out well. The thing that I think about constantly is, you know, we're unlucky that the cops are given a job that's so brutal and so good at crushing revolutionary potential and just being generally awful to people. We're doubly unlucky that they're constantly fed propaganda that turns them basically into fascist monsters. Like you know, it goes from like they go home and they probably watch PragerU, and you know, between that and Ben Shapiro destroys Marx in 60 seconds and all that cringe stuff. My question is, how can we counter and even control that narrative? Because when I think of, like, I think about the Russian Revolution, for example, where the Tsar's imperial guards, I mean, after shooting tons of them, actually felt kind of bad for them. The goal is to get police to feel that sentiment, and the right and like all the bourgeois propaganda that they swallow, they're basically succeeding where the white army propaganda failed. And so how do we create, you know, propaganda? How do we control the narrative that can change their minds at least that much, and thereby, you know, make them less of a threat?
These aren't easy questions, obviously. In Philadelphia, when the Fraternal Order of Police and the Firefighters Union both endorsed Donald Trump, there were movements primarily of Black police officers and firefighters, but also some other groups that protested that this did not represent their views on the one hand, and on the other, in the case of the firefighters, noted that there hadn't been a union vote or anything like that. It's just that the union leaders decided this. And agitated, and I'm not saying that they should have been supporting Joe Biden necessarily, but I am saying that perhaps it's not a complete monolith. There have been demonstrations where I have seen, for example, African-American police officers call for changing training, call for measures to reduce the violence. And to the extent that those movements exist, once you try to engage with them and support them and amplify their voice, yes, because they might be able to change the narrative within police departments. Surely not all of the police were born bastards. You know, it took a culture, an effort, a training to make them that way, yes? And to some extent, perhaps some of them could be won away from that position. through struggle. It's not exactly struggle I welcome personally. Years ago, like 2 years ago, I was listening to a broadcast on NPR about this bluesman who was collecting KKK robes because these Klansers would show up at his concerts, and so he would sit down and talk to them. And he would come back again and again and meet with them, and eventually they would give up the Klan and turn over their Klan paraphernalia to him. This is hard work, and it's not work that I have the patience to undertake. But to the extent that there are people in those institutions or who know people in those institutions or family members or such, perhaps it's work worth doing, and perhaps even important work. Because if we can reduce the bloodshed, clearly any measures that reduce bloodshed, I think, are desirable. The other thing I would say, I agree with Eric that force is not our strong point. There's lots and lots of us, but we're never going to be on an equal playing field in terms of weaponry and training and such. There might be things beyond persuasion, although persuasion is important and outreach is important. But for example, police departments rely upon electricity and other utilities, yes? Workers supply that. Armaments, they rely, it would take a while for them to exhaust their supply of bullets, but it might be possible to cut off new supplies of bullets, which might force them to think about shooting people before they shot them because they had to conserve the available instruments of death. And that's a long term. But to the extent that we make the stuff and transport the stuff, we could make decisions about who we were going to make the stuff for and where we were going to transport it to, yes? Which can at least, or even just like, can they move troops across the country? It's possible to blockade freeways. It's possible to not allow troop transports, to move in airports or railroads or such forth. And that, I feel more confident in our ability to pull that off than I do in our ability to match the Army munitions for munitions. That's not a fight that if it's necessary to defend oneself, I'm not saying one doesn't defend oneself, but I am saying that we should try everything possible to create a situation where there are fewer people coming at us with weapons and where we can try and mitigate the damage that they can do.
Yeah, also too, like, I know, obviously, the police obviously not really trustworthy, but at the end of the day, like, I know they're in the process of still trying to reform, and they should like kind of like cut down on certain aspects as far as their training, because over the course of the years, like I've seen a lot of aggression when it comes to police brutality, and not only that, which it does create, which it does like leaves a big mark to the Black community, and the Black community doesn't really deserve that because they've been through hell on earth many times, and for them to for them to constantly bring a lot of violence into our democracy, that in itself, they should really, and for example too, like, cops, they really do need to be defined. And I think in some cities they already I think cut back on the funding with the cops. But as far as I know, like, what about Boston? Like, is there has been any type of change as far as like defunding and cutting back on the supplies, because that's where they keep gaining all this massive power, and you know, and really, you know, they should be, divided.
John, could you repeat the question? I'm not sure. We're having a little trouble.
Basically,
I was having a
he
little
was arguing that the problem of police reform is a very major one, that we need to defund police. But we also need to look at the training because the training encourages them to behave in certain militarized ways,
That's
dehumanizing.
how they start to get really, really aggressive.
And so it makes, you know, trains them to be aggressive, which then has disastrous consequences for
Yes.
communities of color in particular.
One other point, there was a revolution in Russia in February of 1917 that there was a general strike, all right, and the far leftists, they asked their leaders, you know, supply us with arms. We have to duke it out with the army and the police. They were killing people. And the leaders said, well, if you want guns, go talk to the army. Go talk to the soldiers. And so the workers, you know, under their influence, began to talk to the soldiers and began to receive arms. And, you know, after a few days, the soldiers began firing on the police, right? And the whole government collapsed. So that's a scenario and an example in history of when these conflicts, how they can possibly evolve. Because as John pointed out earlier, the army is generally working class people in uniform, whereas the ranks of the fascists, okay, many of them are in the ranks of the police. But there are many other, there are lots of scenarios. I'll just leave it at that. Over.
May I say something?
Go for it.
I just want to say I'm the most positive person you'll ever meet. You could ask Matt Andrews. I'm always out there. Wherever I go, I am a union salesperson. The person who delivers the mail, I talk to him about their local meetings and their pensions. The Whole Foods worker and the Trader Joe's workers, every time I get groceries, 30-second pitches. When I'm in the mood, I try a 30-second elevator pitch. Yo, think about a union. It takes a long time. Also, where are the pecans? And then like go grab my groceries. The other day, I was out with a British friend of mine. We were at Tati Cafe, and I mentioned the pavement union that just was organized last year. And all the baristas flew up to the front. We're like, we heard about that. We heard about the Starbucks union in Buffalo. And I was like, holy crap, this is the first time like all these people just started, they ran up and they were like, yeah, baristas unite. And I was like, hells yes, thank you. Awesome. So keep doing elevator pitches, keep, little tiny sparks, because yeah, a lot of people, there's a lot of rejection. I get a lot of rejection too. I get a lot of shut up, dude. I'm only here for 6 more months and I'm going to this other job. But keep, positive sales pitches, solidarity sales pitches wherever you go. And let's do this. Let's make New England a syndicate.
Talking to people changes the conditions of our existence. And even little tiny, a while ago I spoke in Boston and I talked about ship workers, and they had these fights over the menus and what was going to be fed to them as they went from port to port. And some people said, oh, that's just menus. It's not. But they were at sea for 2-3 weeks between ports. It's really important on the one hand. And on the other hand, once you've established it, you're going to decide what's going to be served on that ship. Then you can make all sorts of other decisions about what's going to happen, yes? And so, little things build our sense of capacity. They build our actual capacity as well to make decisions and carry them out. But they also build our sense that we can do things. And you see somebody else who does something, you should spread that. And because if they did it, we could do it too, yes? And getting to a general strike, I realize, is a long way from that. But I don't think you get there without those steps.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I love what Sean said, and John, your response. That's I think it's so true that it's like there's so many little things. And it's one thing that's been sitting in the back of my head is that how we tend to pay attention to the kind of the flashy things. Like we've been talking about strikes, and I'm sure I'm not. I know I'm not the first person to say it. It's a kind of a common refrain in the labor movement that workers have the most power in the moments before they decide to go on strike. That actually it's the threat of the strike, even more than the strike itself, that kind of once you enter the strike, it's you're in a different situation. You've kind of you've exposed your strongest card, but the threat of the strike is actually where a lot of demands can be won, and we don't necessarily remember and celebrate those victories in the same way. So I wonder, like, and we see these waves of strike activity or mass protest, and they seem to come like natural phenomena, like they're totally disconnected from whatever we're doing. But really, there are all those little conversations, like what Sean's talking about, that suddenly change people's perceptions of reality. So maybe that's one of our takeaways. It's just like, we need to be, maybe the strike is kind of a distraction almost to the work that needs to be done beforehand. We need to really be deep into this organizing and just changing little things that change people's perception of what our relationships are like. It changes culture. Over.
Steve.
And this discussion has brought to my mind two incidents that occurred. One, the Lip watch factory, which I think was in France. It might have been in Switzerland. But the bosses were in the process of shutting the plant down. That would have been the end of watch manufacturing there. And the workers, I believe through their union, took over the plant and continued producing watches. And those watches were distributed to labor supporters all around Europe and the world. And I don't know how it ended up. I don't know if Flip is still a worker collective or still exists or not. But there's a second one, the storm door company in Chicago. I don't remember the name of it. There again, the bosses were threatening to shut the place down. The workers occupied the plant, would not allow any of the machinery to be removed, and then undertook to continue operating to produce storm doors. Again, I don't know how that ended up, but in both those situations, the workers showed that they could take over the places that they worked in, could continue running them.
And there have been a number of stuff. There have been many, many instances of workers taking over and running for periods of time. And the problem is, if you do one workplace, it's easy for the capitalists to surround you, to starve you out, to undercut you. But if it becomes a broader movement, then you can support each other. So in Argentina, there are still workers' cooperatives that survive from the collapse of the economic system, that have formed a somewhat integrated economic system of supporting each other. And it's not the revolution, but it keeps some people alive on the one hand, and it builds institutions on the other, and it shows possibilities.
Great to see you, Steve.
So are we at the end?
Feel that way?
Quite possibly, unless there are any other questions.
Well, I think it's been a good discussion, and I'm glad to have had it, and would be glad to hear from people if they have questions or follow-ups or whatever down the road. Our site is syndicalist.us, and you can contact us through that or get our contact information.
Wonderful.
Down.
Tomorrow.
All right. Long time no see.
You said Syndicalist US?
Syndicalist, SYNDICALIST.
SYND. SYND. Can you type it in the chat?
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'll put the website for the Boston Labor Solidarity Committee in the chat as well. We sometimes use the acronym BLSC. It's just a WordPress website. It's pretty minimal, but we're a very democratic organization. You can go there and see what rules we use to operate our meetings and such. And you know, we do a lot of. I think we have a really important role to play in the community, doing that kind of general agitation, education. You know, taking on workers' struggles that maybe, you know, don't just fit within one particular workplace. So I hope that if people enjoyed this talk and would like to have more conversations like this in the future, that you'd consider joining the Labor Solidarity Committee. You know, there was recently a nurses' strike here we didn't really touch upon, but you know, we did a lot of solidarity for that. We pool our modest resources and go out with banners, and you know, we're able to do a lot for a group that as small as we are. We do a lot. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming, and I thought it was an excellent conversation.
There was 4 of us on the picket line here. Bill and Steve and me and Lloyd. Lloyd, yeah.
Yeah, that was a very, very huge battle.
We were accused of harassing the scabs.
Harassing the scabs?
Yeah, I'm serious. This
Jane.
was
This
in
was
Worcester.
2 months.
Yeah.
In a row, you know.
I wasn't
Yeah,
on the
5
line,
of
but
us.
I did hear about it.
There was 5 of us on the picket line. There was Steve and Bill and Jane and me and Lloyd.
But don't the scabs need your sympathy?
Oh, Mary was there. Okay. Everybody. Good. Yeah. We had bullhorns, like 2, 3 of them, and we'd yell at the scabs when
It's
they
a
came on
solid
the
way
bus.
to make a living, because those are traveling crews of very well-paid scabs who go
Oh,
across the
yeah.
country